Welcome, everybody. My name is COSTANZA MUSU, and I am a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs of the University of Ottawa. And it is my pleasure to chair this that promises to be a very interesting event on Syria. What next? So we have very distinguished panelists today with us. I will introduce them very briefly. Starting from the right, we have Bob Fowler, who has had a distinguished career as a Canadian diplomat and public servant, and he served as Canadian ambassador to the United Nations and to Italy, and advisor to 3 prime ministers. Margaret Bloodworth, who's completed her distinguished public service career as a National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister and Associate Secretary to the Cabinet. And prior to that, she was Deputy Minister of Public Safety, Deputy Minister of National Defense, and Deputy Minister of Transport. To my left is Roland Paris, who's a University Research Chair in International Security and Governance. He is also the Director of the Center for International Policy Studies, the CIPS, that has organized this event, as well as, of course, a colleague at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And then David PETRASEK, who's also professor at the School of Public and International Affairs, and was formerly a special advisor to the Secretary General of Amnesty International, and worked extensively on human rights, humanitarian, and conflict resolution issues for Amnesty International, as well as for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So these are all very qualified speakers. Just 1 minute of housekeeping, so to speak. I will now give the floor to the speakers. They've all been asked to speak for a maximum of 10 minutes. So we'll have a first round of presentation. We'll then open the floor for questions. As you can see by the light and the cameras, the medias are here. And therefore, we would ask you to please make your way in the crowd, if you can, to the microphone that is to that side of the room, and to introduce yourself and present your question, speaking in the microphone. The microphone actually only works for the cameras, not for the room, so also please speak up when you pose your question. So the order of presentation will start with Bob Fowler, who will then be followed by David, and we'll then have Margaret and Roland. So Bob, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Costanza, and fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure to be with you here today on this subject. In fact, it's probably a much greater pleasure to be with you today on this subject than it would have been when we were asked to form this panel not so very long ago. Things look better today than they did even a few days ago. In fact, for any kind of a professional in the foreign policy business, these are very exciting times. Op-eds by the President of Russia, addresses to the nation by the President of the United States, and people sort of parsing their grammar to see who won how many points on which subject. I was quite convinced when we were asked to form this panel that the U.S. was about to strike somebody, somewhere in Syria, that because the United States was terribly upset that the Assad regime was deemed to have murdered 1,400 of its citizens with gas, that the proper reaction to that would be to go and murder a bunch more Syrians to express our dismay, which struck me as a rather strange proposition. I didn't know who they would strike or how they would strike or where they would strike, and I certainly couldn't understand why they would strike. Why we would want in the West to engage ourselves in yet another disaster in the Middle East, and why anybody thought that becoming Al-Qaeda's air force once again would be a good thing. in other words, I was concerned that insufficient due diligence was being applied to the situation. And yes, that the reasons for action had a hell of a lot more to do with what was happening in Washington than what was happening in Damascus. But the president, after very carefully aiming his gun at his left temple, seems to have dodged the bullet, at least for the moment. If the Russians can possibly avoid goading and gloating for a little while longer, then maybe this idea of inventorying and containing and dismantling chemical weapons under international supervision might work. I'm not counting those chickens yet, but it's a very good start. So that's where I come from in all this. I'm very pleased with the way things have evolved. I didn't think strikes would have been useful or achieved anything other than some very bad things for the Syrians, bad things for peace and stability in the Middle East, and much more broadly bad things in terms of terrorism and the further clash of values between radical Islam and the West. I do not think that the West should be involving itself in a 15 centuries old religious sectarian struggle or a civil war in the middle of Syria. I have enormous sympathy for the pain that the people of Syria and surrounding countries are suffering, and for the miserable conditions in the refugee camps surrounding Syria, but I do not believe that Western intervention will help that. And I don't believe that invoking fairy tale principles of international conventions, which are not norms, could ever justify such an intervention. Costanza, are you gonna yell numbers at us or for timing or something?
You're not there yet.
Oh, good. Oh, so you're not waving 3 minutes at me yet?
Not yet.
No, okay.
You still have
Okay.
close.
Oh my God, that's wonderful. So look, what I'd like to talk about a little bit then is war aims. And one of the most startling things about the events over the past days for me is, first of all, it does further highlight some of the fiascos we have known in the region over the last 10 years. And cannot help, I think, cause people to wonder how do you get here? I mean, how did we come so close, and we might be there again, to doing something that is clearly stupid, despite the fact lots of wise people know it would be that? How does that happen? What would be? I made a flippant remark 2 days ago when we were meeting first-year students in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, when I suggested that when I had been in the Defense Department, we had had the last good war, and what I meant was that when the West, led by Father Bush, decided to throw Iraq out of Kuwait, it was a very carefully considered thing. A coalition, a vast international coalition representing most significant parts of the world, was assembled. Military plans were drawn up with care and attention. The war aim was very simple. A member state of the United Nations had been invaded by a neighbor. That was not right. The Security Council agreed it was not right, and that invasion should be reversed. And then it was. Those war aims were articulated, were explained to people around the world and to voters. People understood what the mission was and was not about. And when that mission had been accomplished, they stopped. There was no mission creep. It wasn't suddenly about other things, including votes in red states or blue states. It was about freeing Kuwait from an invasion. And when Saddam Hussein's forces had been sufficiently reduced and degraded to no longer pose an immediate threat to the nations in the region, including, of course, Kuwait, there was no talk of regime change. There was no talk about democratization. And no, Nipa, there wasn't even any talk of putting little girls in school. It was about doing what people said they were going to do, and then they went and did it, and then they went home. If you look at what then happened in Afghanistan and what happened in Iraq and what happened in Libya and what seemed about to happen in Syria, none of that took place. There were no, what would be the war aims of strikes on Syria? What did you expect to accomplish? How carefully had you analyzed the cost-benefit equation? How feasible were the war aims? In 1990, they were feasible. A careful military analysis suggested that that coalition would likely to be successful in throwing the Iraqis out of Kuwait at an acceptable cost. And both of those things turned out to be right. And there was no such assessment for the other follies of the last decade, and there should have been. And certainly, with regard to military action against Syria, that sort of a calculation should be made before any such action would take place. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Constanza. 10 minutes, I'm going to make 4 points. I think the first one I want to make is the point about the complexity of the Syrian conflict and the need for outsiders to be humble about proposing solutions. Now, this might seem obvious, but it isn't always obvious in at least the debate in the media. The question is, what now or what next? And the truth is, if any one of the 4 panelists had an answer to that question, we wouldn't be here. We'd be knocking on Ban Ki-moon's door or John Kerry's or somewhere else. So I think we really have to start from this point. Syria's war is several wars. It's the Syrian people who've risen up against a dictatorial regime, at least a majority of the Syrian people, but sadly, or the fact is not all of them. It's a sectarian civil war. It's a regional Sunni versus Shia battle, as Bob has said. It's Iran in its ongoing conflict with the Gulf monarchies. It's Israel and Hezbollah. It is perhaps the harbinger of a new Lebanese civil war, but being fought in Syria. It's Turkey's ongoing conflict with the PKK, the Kurdish armed group. It's the Syrian Kurds who are fighting the Syrian Arabs. It's the US and Iran, and I could go on. You can just play this list out and realize how many different conflicts are playing out in Syria. Obviously, the solution when it comes, and I fear it won't be soon, will be a new political dispensation in Syria. But what that looks like, and even if it maintains Syria's present boundaries, is to me very unclear. The best thing we can hope for is a ceasefire and a very large peacekeeping presence to monitor it. It may take years before that ceasefire would result in a political solution. In fact, we may not be able to solve the conflict in Syria until other conflicts in the region are solved. Just give you one example. In the last month, in fact, every month since June in Iraq, over 1,000 civilians have died in Iraq. And the casualty figures for this year in Iraq are the highest they've been since 2006. There's still a civil war going on in Iraq. Large numbers of Iraqis are fighting in Syria on both sides. Solving Syria may require us to think again about Iraq. This is just one example. So, it's complex. That shouldn't be an excuse, though, for inaction, given the scale of the atrocities. We can't let the complexities of it completely tie our hands. So point 2, the military strike. Like Bob, I'm skeptical. On the terms it was discussed and proposed, I think it would have been futile and dangerous. He's explained why it's dangerous. In terms of its futility, an air campaign offered on the terms being proposed proposed would offer little protection for civilians. It may dissuade Assad from using chemical weapons again, but most people who are dying in Syria are dying at the hands of weapons that are not easily taken out from the air. People who disagree with this point raise Kosovo as an example. They say, no, in Kosovo we waged an air war in 1999. NATO did, again outside UN authorization, and the sort of sense of that is it was a success. In fact, for people who followed that crisis and still remember it, I at the time was working as a human rights researcher. More civilians, in fact, a great bulk of civilians, died and suffered repression once NATO's air campaign began. There were, of course, killings in Kosovo before NATO's air war, but there was a reprisal attacks of repression that NATO's air forces did very little to prevent. They could take out the heavy weaponry, but not much else. It's also futile military strike because, as proposed, it's delinked from a political process. Again, in Kosovo, what Milosevic needed to do to stop the airstrikes was reasonably clear, because there was a deal on the table and there was a process. In this case, that's not true, despite the agreement in Geneva last year. And fourth, and this is the point about it's dangerous, it will provoke a response. Maybe not immediately, but it will provoke a response. And that's one that, to my mind, means that the war, as proposed by President Obama, could not be contained. Has the threat of the use of force helped? People looking now at the discussions on the chemical weapons may say yes. That's hard to assess. The fact is that more civilians have been killed in Syria since August 24th, when the first credible threat of military action was made. More have been killed since that date than were killed by chemical weapons in the attack on the 21st. Okay, third point. I'm not sure. It's a hard point to make, but I'll make it. There are still other options. The blockage in the Security Council is real. The Russians and the Chinese bear an enormous share of the blame for that, but there are other options. The refusal to countenance a resolution of any sort in the Security Council doesn't mean that a group of like-minded states, Western states, but working with other states in Africa, in Americas, in the region, many states in the region, of course, are upset with what's going on in Syria, to take other collective measures. Now, people have spoken about a referral of the case to the International Criminal Court, which would require a Security Council resolution and is unlikely. But there's other ways. I mean, there's nothing stopping a group of like-minded states from themselves launching an international justice initiative that named the people and that potentially came together in an ad hoc tribunal. It would not have the legitimacy of an ICC process, but there are other options. To my mind, the focus from the beginning of the Syrian conflict, well, not the focus, let's put it this way, the suggestion from the beginning of the conflict, all the way back in the fall of 2011, the suggestion was on the table that there may be military action without UN authorization. And I think at least part of the explanation for the Russian and Chinese opposition in the Security Council, at least part of the explanation for their reluctance to countenance a resolution, is their fear that it would, even if it didn't authorize military force, it would be used later to justify it, as in fact was done in Iraq and Kosovo. Fourth, do I have time? Fourth, we were also asked to look at the question of what can Canada do. I was hoping that I'd almost be out of time because not much to say. 2 minutes? Three. Oh, okay, good, right. Well, not much is the answer. The fact is, and this is, it's a sad reflection, but I do not believe that our government has the standing or the capacity to play a major role in the renewed efforts that are needed to achieve a ceasefire. Certainly we can support it, and certainly we can take certain steps, but I cannot see a major role for our government to get involved and to have the credibility and standing necessary to help to broker some kind of a ceasefire in the region. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything. Canada could be involved in mobilizing efforts for international justice in Syria, despite the talk of the current government, hard talk, and despite their many condemnations of the abuses in Syria, they have not gone on record to support the Security Council referring the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. There was one mention of it by the Foreign Minister, but Canada has refused to sign on petitions launched by 60 UN member states, putting pressure on the Security Council to make such a referral. We could do much more in that area. Refugee resettlement. It seems woefully inadequate to respond to the scale of the atrocities in Syria by talking about dealing with the refugees, but the sad fact is that there's millions of them. They're now facing life in camps in Lebanon and Jordan, of course in Lebanon in a very destable situation. Canada has contributed substantially to relief efforts, humanitarian efforts. I don't know enough about that to critique it. What I do know is that so far the government has announced in terms of refugee resettlement that Canada would take 1,300 Syrian refugees. 1956 we took 50,000 Hungarian refugees. We're a wealthier country today. I find that a very inadequate response. It's not a good response to what to do about Syria, but it is something our government could be doing. Of the 1,300, only 200 of those will be sponsored by the government. 1,100 will be privately sponsored. This is shameful. And again, I know this is an inadequate response to the big question for this panel, but it is something concrete that could be done immediately and by our own government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Margaret, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Costanza. Well, I agree with Bob that it is different than what we thought when we were first asked to be here. It could be said to be more positive or at least less pessimistic, maybe a better point to make. There's obviously a lot that can be said, so let me just make 3 or 4 points in 10 minutes. We were told 8, but I guess you knew we'd take longer. So 10 minutes. First point I would make, and maybe it's an obvious one, but you're not always aware of it when you read a lot of the critique of what is going on in various places. There is no good option available. I'm defining a good option as something that means peace or at least a quick transition to peace in Syria, transition to democracy or at least a more benign dictatorship where multiple sectarian communities live in peace and if not harmony, at least tolerance under an effective government. I don't see that in the foreseeable future, and David's referred to some of the reasons that may be the case. So we are in the world of the least bad. Now, and I agree with, I think both Bob and David have made the point, we need to be, those of us who sit many thousands of miles away, appropriately humble about what we can actually do to bring about or to help with a least bad option. The second point I'd make is it can only be a good thing if Syria were really to turn over its chemical weapons to international control and eventual destruction. Fewer chemical weapons in the world is a good thing. But we should not underestimate the challenges in actually achieving this, even assuming the Syrian government means what it says and will cooperate at least to some extent. I don't think the jury's still out on that, although they have signed on to the accord. We're in a war-torn country. Many places are too dangerous for international representatives to go, and even guaranteed by the government they can't go everywhere. Chemical weapons are easily hidden, and they can be moved around, and there's a lot of evidence and suggestion they are being moved around. The precursors for chemical weapons are used for many other things, and it's fairly easy to keep some of those and make more. And the actual destruction of chemical weapons, of which I know very little, but I do know enough to know it can be lengthy and difficult and take a lot of money and a lot of effort. And there are many ways for the Syrian government to stall and drag their feet. All of that said, it is still a good thing that it's at least on the table and we're looking forward to that. That is a positive development. Third point I'd make is we actually only are where we are with the possibility of the Syrians giving up their chemical weapons on the table because of the threat of military strike. Now, I agree with Bob's points about war aims and so on. If I'd have been here a week ago, I would have been saying, boy, lots of risks, don't know what this is going to happen. I don't know what the Americans' plan is. I'm sure they had a plan. They probably had 2 or 3 plans. But what the goal of those plans were, I suspect, was pretty fuzzy. Lots of risks. But I have to say, we're only where we are today because they threatened military strike. Now, I know Assad says, no, he agreed because the Russians proposed that, but count me more than skeptical on that one. The Russians did propose a way out of a military force by the U.S. But if the use of military force was to disappear, I don't think it would take too long for the Syrians to backtrack. I think they may well try to do that in any event, or at least stall. And hence, I think it's important not to take that option off the table in the near future. And it's always risky to have an option on the table that you think is highly risky. And I am not saying that as a supporter of military strikes, but as a realist that says we are where we are because of that threat. Now, actually, fortunately for that point of view, Putin may have helped that come to a greater likelihood by his op-ed piece yesterday, which annoyed many American legislatures and might actually have increased Obama's support, for good or for ill. The fourth point I'd make, which is similar to one David made, is that Syria is a complex situation, and sorting out the good guys and the bad guys is not easy. They are not easily distinguishable. And our definition of good guys and bad guys may not even accord with the definition of what Syrians would think were good guys and bad guys. And I'm even talking about the Syrians that we likely would support. As a simple example, Syrian Christians, and of which there is a big component, 10% of the population is Christian. You would think that would be, on the face of it, that might be a population that was more amenable to the West or more sympathetic to the West or vice versa. But in fact, the vast majority of them support Assad, as do the Shiites and Alawites that he's a part of. And the reason, there's a very good reason for that. They fear, with good reason, that if the rebels were to prevail, they feel at best persecution and at worst massacre. And they have some good reasons for fearing that. So it is a very complex situation of which we know a very, very little. And in the end, a future way of coexisting in peace and tolerance, I don't use harmony because I don't think that's in the foreseeable future, not in my lifetime anyways. It can only come from Syrians. Now, I did hear as I was coming here that actually they're talking about restarting the peace process in Geneva. One can have all sorts of doubts about that, but it's a good thing. It's better to be talking, even if people are still throwing weapons at one another, than not talking. On that, I can agree with the diplomats. And I think outsiders can play a role, but we should be very humble about what role we have, and certainly we cannot impose what the solution would be. Let me finish with a couple of more comments and questions than analysis, and that's the Russian role. I find that fascinating. I think there'll be lots written and analysis done of why the Russians are doing this and what their real motives are. I find it hard myself, having spent over 30 years in government, to believe that the proposal came spontaneously just a few hours after an off-the-cuff remark by Kerry. Maybe, but I find that hard to believe. Given Obama was in at the G20 with Putin last weekend, were there at least some general discussions? I don't mean there was a deal. I don't think there was a deal. But some general discussions, perhaps. And clearly, I think Putin knew before he made the offer that Assad was going to say yes. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said it. Whatever its origin, I think it is positive. I think his op-ed in the New York Times is also very interesting. I don't actually know his real reason for doing that. I have no doubt he enjoyed greatly poking the Americans in the eye, as the Americans enjoy poking the Russians in the eye from time to time. But I don't believe he would actually have done that for that reason. He's a smart guy and been around for a long time. So I don't know what his actual purpose or goal was. And as I said, the result may be increase in congressional support for Obama's motion. All these congressional people who felt insulted and resentful of his comments. I think, though, where I am at the moment is I choose to see it as positive, and not just for the Syrian situation. I think it could be a positive sign of Russian willingness to play a more prominent role in world peace and security more generally. And that, I think, is only positive. Whatever you think of the Russians and the defects in their government, of which there are some, they are still a significant power in the world. And if they were to play a more prominent as opposed to a blocking role in world peace and security, I think that would only be positive. Doesn't mean we'd always agree with them or we'd always like what they were doing, but time will tell. But I think that could be positive. I think I still have a minute or two. So let me add something about Canada's role. I think we should be really humble about what our role could be. I agree with David. I don't think we have enough weight to play any major role in bringing parties together and so on. We have done a lot in humanitarian. I think we can do a lot more. We need to be worried about the countries of the region. Stability of Jordan is a big question mark we should all have. And if we can do more and put more aid in there to help that, that would be a good thing. I do think, and I agree with David on this, we could do more on refugees. There's 2 million refugees now. Many will want to go home, but not all will want to go home. And I suspect we may be into a long-term situation like the Coptic Christians in Egypt, in which many Syrian Christians will want to leave, not seeing a future that's amenable to them, and we could play a role in that. I don't think we have a role militarily. Even if we were to want to have a role militarily, I don't think we have much to contribute. And I'm skeptical even about peacekeepers. I don't see that in the near future, and I don't think actually we would be a great contributor to that, given our role in the region right at the moment.
Thank you, Margaret. Roland.
Thank you. I think a couple of years ago we had a panel with Paul Heinbecker where he quoted a saying from the United Nations where he said, "We have reached the point in the proceedings where everything has been said, but not everyone has said it yet." So I will attempt to be the fourth person and not to be too repetitive, or at least to make the same points in ways that you don't recognize them as the same points. The first point that I want to make is one that hasn't come up yet, but I think it's important for us to at least consider as we move forward in this discussion, which is the strange, I think strange, weakness of American and vacillation in American diplomacy during this whole period, and what I think is the damage that this episode has done, perhaps minor damage, but damage nonetheless, to Barack Obama's credibility internationally and to his political capital at home. It's almost like people need to have reminders that words matter in international affairs, that offhand remarks from the President of the United States or senior administration officials really matter. If the President says Assad must go and doesn't have a plan for carrying that through, that's serious business. If the President says there are red lines, echoing the kind of language that the George Herbert Walker Bush administration used against the Saddam Hussein regime, threatening Saddam Hussein regime not to use chemical weapons during the first Gulf War, I mean, that's serious business. And to use that language without apparently fully thinking through the implications, that's also serious business. To take the country, the United States, to the brink of war following the traditional script and series of steps that lead up to the use of military force, and then suddenly to flip the decision to Congress in a way that was arguably not constitutionally required and that was politically a very strange decision, sent an unusual message. And then to have the Secretary of State make what appeared to be an offhand remark in a press conference. I suspect, as Margaret does, that there had been some discussions of this before, but all the appearances are that this was not a message that was planned to be sent at that public availability, judging by the way he described it and by the fact that his own officials immediately afterwards said, "Oh, this is just rhetorical. This is just hypothetical. This isn't meant as a firm proposal," etc. It speaks to the same kind of casualness and lack of care and consistency. So there's a point here which I think should be a matter of some concern about the handling of U.S. foreign policy, and to the extent that this is a problem that might be a more general problem. I haven't seen evidence of it being a more general problem, but it does raise the question, at least, about the Obama administration. And I think that Obama suffers some damage internationally. He comes out seeming inconsistent and irresolute. That is not good. I think the Iranians would make a huge mistake if they were to interpret from this that the United States would would respond to the same way towards Iran and the issue of nuclear weapons in Iran. Big difference being that for many American policy leaders, Syria is not a matter of vital national interest for the U.S., although Iran is. Nevertheless, the president's behavior during this crisis raises questions about constancy. And, you know, in terms of political capital at home, Richard Neustadt, in his classic study of presidential politics, put it well, and it hasn't really been bettered since, that political capital is fungible. It doesn't sit in one issue. It flows from one issue to another. And at any given time, there's a perception that a political leader has influence or doesn't. And this damaged Obama's perceived political influence in the United States. And considering that he's approaching the second part of his second term and wants to get immigration bill through, et cetera, it might have some longer term implications. This, I think, the outcome here was ended up being okay. Okay in the sense that I think that in the end, this agreement in principle to pursue neutralization, the securing, and perhaps ultimately the destruction of Syrian chemical weapons does go some way to reaffirm what I think is not a fairy tale principle at all, but a real norm of non-use of chemical weapons. You know, there aren't that many international norms out there that are observed in most places and most times, and I disagree with Bob on this. I think that this is actually. Yep, go ahead.
My fairy tale principle reference was to R2P.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Not to
I'm
chemical
sorry.
weapons.
Okay, very good.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, thanks for the clarification. So to the extent that it reaffirmed that non-use of chemical weapons norm, I think it's a reasonably good outcome. However, as David and Margaret both pointed out, we are a long way away from those weapons being in custody, identified, not least removed entirely from the battlefield. And, you know, in fact, I think that this is mainly a victory for Assad and for Putin. Because if you think about what is required in order to actually deliver on this pledge in principle, you know, identifying and disclosing and securing all of these sites, you know, an estimated 1,400 tons of chemical agent, sarin, VX, mustard agents that have been scattered across the country, and at least, from the last report that I read, at least 50 sites. And the fact that, as Margaret pointed out, this concession came about as the result of a threat of military force. And it is not possible for that threat of military force to remain at the same level of credibility and intensity indefinitely. It's already diminished. And given the amount of time that will be required to identify and secure those weapons, the opportunities for distraction and deflection and reneging are many. So, you know, these concessions were made under pressure, and I think the pressure will be very hard to maintain over the long haul. Now, the one caveat on that point, I said mainly a victory for Russia and Assad. Obviously, they bailed out. They had their own reasons for wanting to do so, but they also gave, through Obama, a lifeline. So, and you could almost in Ottawa hear the collective sigh of relief coming from official Washington kind of floating across the continent. So in that sense, Obama got out of a very tricky situation. But there's another element too, which is that to the extent that the discussions between Kerry and Lavrov reached some kind of general agreement, and that there's a firm commitment by Assad, backed by Russia, to do certain things with regard to the now acknowledged chemical weapons that belong to the Syrian regime, including disclosing all of them and allowing international inspectors to look at them and then securing them. To the extent that there are firm commitments, that does create a slightly different situation going forward. You know, it's not impossible to imagine that if the United States at some point in the future wished to return to a more aggressive posture towards the Assad regime, that they would probably be on stronger grounds, given those commitments, than they were a week ago. I mean, if they were included in a UN Security Council resolution, for example, I think we can imagine, for instance, quite a different outcome in a vote in the British House of Commons in the event that Assad was refusing to deliver on very specific commitments. Of course, this is very hypothetical, but it's one possible effect of going down this road that we should keep in mind. How much time do I have? A minute? Okay.
No, 40 seconds.
40 seconds, okay. Well, let me just conclude then by saying that we're in danger, as the other panelists have pointed out, of being absorbed in the discussion about chemical weapons. And it's an important discussion, but it's often conflated with the Civil War. And the end to this civil war is not going to come through the negotiation of any agreement on chemical weapons. So we must keep sight of that larger picture. And although I don't have time to talk about it now, perhaps during the question period, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the larger regional and historical context here as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the panelists. You have Bob, you
make a comment in Margaret and Roland's, I think, perfectly correct suggestion that it was to some extent Obama's red line threat that brought about all this. I can't disagree with that basic premise, but it was I'd just like to highlight that it was a heavily discounted threat. I mean, for him to hum and haw and flip and flop on red lines, and then to make blindingly clear that the threat included no boots on the ground. I mean, how's that going to shake Assad to his core?
It didn't shake him to his core, but it got him on chemical weapons.
I'm
Which
not.
are not a huge
And let's recall that Assad has said that the deal depends on the Americans not supplying arms to the rebels, which they are doing and will continue to do.
We've given a lot of questions from the audience, but I just wanted to comment, Roland, on your point about words and in diplomacy. And I don't know, maybe it's, I'm not a scholar of international relations. My field is international law, so words are important in law too. But I've seen a lot of comment in the press about that. People are upset. It seems that Obama was clumsy. And there's some sense that, you need to maintain consistency in order to make clear the other side what your intentions are. But isn't that the thinking that took George W. to war in Iraq a little bit? I mean, the facts changed. Obama changed his mind. I've been reading this, and originally I also thought, oh, he's waffled, it's terrible. But then I thought maybe another way of looking at it, this is just to say, maybe we should welcome a U.S. president who really is deeply, deeply reluctant to use force. And actually, the facts changed. He changed his mind. And now many of the newspapers in the U.S. that were concerned about his threat of force are now criticizing him precisely on those terms.
I think you're right.
There's something there. There's a kind of a sense that, in the lead up to the Iraq War, one of the reasons the Bush administration gave for continuing was we've made a threat and we're not going to change our mind. Even though the weapons inspectors were saying, well, actually, maybe you should, because we've got some information that's different than when you made your threat.
I would agree with that, except for one thing. One would hope that the President of the United States would be flexible enough to change his, or maybe someday her, mind on a policy that was clearly heading in the wrong direction. But there's no evidence that I've seen, or at least the evidence that I've seen leads me to the uncomfortable conclusion that the initial position itself wasn't very well thought through, and that the change of position wasn't necessarily very well thought through. It's one thing to have a clearly articulated and well thought through position, and then to realize that circumstances have changed, overtaken by events, and to make a shift. But it's another thing to move from almost flittingly, seemingly, quickly and not very carefully taken positions. And I think that there's a distinction there. I guess I'll stop there. I was going to respond to Bob, but I want to leave space and time.
Okay.
Can I make just one
Of
comment
course.
since I'm the fourth? First, I agree that it was not a well-thought-out military threat, like Bob said, but it was enough to bring Assad to the table. I don't think it's any accident that Kerry went to Geneva kind of the next day. I think the Americans realize they have a very short window because, as William says, you cannot keep a military threat credible over long periods of time. The only other comment I'd make is I think Obama has been weak on this, and I don't think it's about changing his mind. I think he was weak when he made the first comments last year. I don't think they were well thought out. And I don't think this is a well thought out strategy. I think he really didn't want to do military threat, and he's used everything he can to get out of it. Going to Congress was a very strange reaction on his part. And I think it was, one could argue, he was hoping to be stopped by them. Then he could say, see, I wanted to, and they. Now, that's maybe a little bit crass. But I think he has been weak and he has been damaged by this. And I don't think it's about changing his mind, because I agree, you want leaders who, when the facts change, will change their minds. That's not weak. It's the other things around, I think, that have to display the weakness.
Okay, well, we're gonna open to the floor now. As you know, there is a microphone. There is already, I think, a line up there. I would like to, before we open it to the floor, for just 1 second, abuse the chair privilege and make 3 very short comments or questions. So one point that came from Bob's presentation was that the last time that, in a way, the framework was legal and acceptable for intervention was the first Iraq War. And so I guess my question to you or to the panel would be, this is an interstate war, at least the first call for was. And so what are the provision, and should there be a provision for intrastate wars? Because this is the example you use is really very deeply different from the situation we have. So the dilemma is not so much deciding whether in an interstate, somewhat clear-cut case of invasion of state A, of state B, from state B, but rather in an intrastate war. Another point on David, who mentioned the necessity to solve our conflict in the region, and this strikes me like the ultimate paradox of the Middle East, because all conflicts are intertwined, and as someone myself who studies, for example, the Arab-Israeli conflict, that also seems to depend from other conflicts being solved or other issues being solved. And it's almost like there is never a beginning from solving any of them because they are so interlinked. Just one final point on the Obama issue. What I find quite paradoxical from the discussion about the credibility of the threat is how much of that credibility comes from the fact that a very much criticized and largely deemed illegal war, actually, namely the war on Iraq, the 2003 war in Iraq, actually ultimately lends credibility to a military threat today. Because a lot of the believing that the United States would go to war or would intervene militarily, at least in Syria, derived from the previous intervention in 2003. So I found that quite paradoxical as what lends credibility to what. So these were just some thought I wanted to share. And maybe I will get responses to that, but I would like to open it to the floor. If you can please project your voice, because the mic will not actually amplify your voice, and introduce yourself and present your question, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm 6 feet 4 inches tall, so I don't know if my voice is going to reach the microphone below me, but okay, it's good. I'm Philip Schubert. I would like to raise a possibility that the chemical weapons probably are spread on both sides. First, they're not that hard to manufacture. The rebels have overrun military bases already in the 2 years that have unfolded. Also, I guess I was taken by the fact that on August 18th, there was quite a lot of press coverage of a UN mission arriving to look for chemical weapons, given that there was some evidence of them having been used at different times on both sides. And I guess I was further intrigued by the fact that on August 21st, there was Technicolor coverage of the attack, if you like, and the victims, very well covered here. And so I guess I was prepared to some extent to buy into the Russian argument that it wasn't clear as to who actually carried out the attack and to what extent the attack, in fact, caused a lot of victims. Maybe there's more evidence since then. We're still waiting for the report from the UN inspectors now that have gone back, although they're not going to make necessarily a finding as to who actually carried out the attack. So I'm wondering if, and it's just what the commentators might think, is that perhaps Assad is in fact quite happy to get rid of these weapons, these chemical weapons, because they're hard to use. They're easy to use, but they're hard to control in terms of what happens because it depends which way the wind's blowing, and they're just basically gases in pressure tanks, and they can be easily released. But then you're not sure who you're going to kill when you do it. And you might end up by killing people on what you would call as your own side. So I just put that forward, and maybe that's why it wasn't such a hard thing for Assad to agree to be rid of these weapons, with the hope that if they're also on the side that he's fighting, on the rebel side, spread through who knows what types of bodies, that this might provide an opportunity to try and rid that side of these weapons as well, though I think that will be a major challenge.
Thank you. We'll take another question.
Thank you, Tony Halliday. Just an observation. I think more advised than the red line in the sand was the Assad must go line. That is there, and it has the implications that regime change must be the fundamental end game as far as the United States is concerned. And what the Putin initiative does, and I think it's actually one of its more hopeful aspects, is it forces the Americans, indirectly obviously, to negotiate with Assad. You can't say this guy's got to go when he's the counter-signatory on a piece of paper 6 weeks down the road. And maybe you'll start to see the making of a political settlement which will not exclude Assad. I think that may be hopeful. It doesn't really tell us where we're finally going to end up, but it gets us over this patch. The other thing that I wanted to say was that in all this doubt and uncertainty and complexity and time delays, there's been one very certain voice, and that's John Baird. John Baird knew right from the start what had to happen. You had to go and bomb the hell out of Assad. Having said that, he said, well, of course, we're not involved. Now, I find that unseemly. I find it particularly unseemly for a country to be lecturing, presumably the United States, with what's holding you guys back? Go and do it, for heaven's sake. We criticized you over Iraq, but we're not going to criticize you over Syria. So if you want to know what my view is of what Canada's position should be on all this, given all this uncertainty, is just shut up.
Okay, we'll now give an opportunity to the panelists to respond to the various comments.
Maybe, if you don't mind, on the last point, Assad must go, implying that regime change is the U.S. objective in Syria, and that this deal will lead to negotiations which then, neutralizes regime change as an objective. I don't think regime change is the objective for the United States in Syria, which makes it even more puzzling why Obama would have made those remarks. Although, to be fair, at the time it looked like he was going to go, so perhaps the costs of making those comments didn't seem to be so significant. No, they don't want regime change in Syria. For at least two reasons. One is obviously because they're concerned about extremist elements of the opposition that they don't want to see attain power, and secondly, because paradoxically they want the Syrian regime to retain control of the chemical weapons so that they don't fall into the wrong hands. So they don't want the Syrian regime to use the chemical weapons. But they do want them to retain control of the chemical weapons. They don't want the Syrian regime to win, as the Russians do. But they don't want the opposition necessarily to depose the Syrian regime either. Now, this isn't as crazy as it sounds. These wars end in one of two ways. Either one side beats the other, or there's a stalemate that leads to exhaustion, which creates a situation which is ripe for a negotiation. The United States, by all appearances, is trying to position its policy to lead to the latter option. That is, stalemate, exhaustion, negotiation. To get to that negotiation, you have to be able to set a table and have the parties come to the table. That's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. You also need exhaustion. And we're not at exhaustion yet. So while it would be wonderful if these discussions about chemical weapons reinvigorate the effort to establish a conference that will bring the opponents of the regime and the regime to the same table, I don't think the conditions on the ground are there yet for a negotiated settlement, as David, I think, also suggested, although I very much hope that I'm wrong.
One would imagine that there's not really one side and another side, and that's really the problem. The other side is actually very crowded and composed of groups of various nature, including some groups that the United States define as terrorist. So it'd be a very crowded conversation with some excluded, one imagine. Margaret. Sorry.
Well, I agree with what Roland has just said, that I don't think regime change is the American interest, but that does raise the question of why Obama said it. And you don't need all the parties to be exhausted. You just need enough on the rebel side and Assad to be exhausted to create a credible group to be in. But I agree with Roland that that too, we're not there yet. On the chemical weapons spread on both sides, I think what convinces me that indeed it was the Syrian government that used the chemical weapons recently was Obama really did not want to do this. This was clear he did not want to go down this path of a military strike. It's been very clear this week. It was clear before that week. So my guess is his intelligence officials spent a whole lot of time convincing him that indeed it was the Syrian government to use those, to the point where he felt he had no option to live up to what he'd said before. Now that's very different than the case in Iraq, where you had a government that wanted to go to war and basically said, find me evidence that suggests, something hadn't happened. Here you had a president who didn't want to conclude this. So that to me is the most convincing argument. Yes, it's not impossible the rebels have some chemical weapons, but I haven't seen any evidence of that yet. And it's true that they're not that difficult to use if you have them, but you do need some facility to produce them because you don't want to kill the people that are making it. So it's actually, while it's not that difficult to make, you need some safe facility to do so, and I haven't seen any evidence that the rebels have it. Would some of the rebels use them if they had it? I don't have much doubt they would. I just haven't seen the evidence that suggests they do
have it. I couldn't help but think of Henry Kissinger's famous line on the Iran-Iraq war, listening to Roland, when you recall that Henry concluded that isn't it a pity that they both can't lose. And I think that is probably right, Roland, that the policy thinking in Washington would like to see both sides seriously exhausted and less capable of doing anything. I am very concerned about all those tons of chemical weapons falling into the hands of the al-Nusra Front. They will use them. I am in the same way that if Al-Qaeda or the Taliban can get hold of loose Pakistani nukes, they will certainly use them. And therefore, with all those many weapon sites and the fact that many weapons arsenals have been raided by the rebels, and the likelihood that if the rebels had got hold of some chemical weapons, the Assad regime would have been too embarrassed to admit it. I think it is perfectly possible. And yes, I do recall when the Bosnians shelled themselves
during the Balkan Wars in order to attract exactly this kind of reaction, and they did attract this kind of reaction when the CIA began a massive rearmament program of the Bosniaks. So I don't know, certainly, I don't think anybody knows, but I think the possibility that the rebels could have done this or could still do it is very real, and therefore I like the idea that Assad might be wise enough to want to get rid of the chemical weapons so they wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. I can't quite get there in my own head, but it's a very attractive idea.
David.
Yeah, well, it's the Middle East, so we should expect conspiracy theories. But the overwhelming evidence points to the use by soldiers fighting on the side of the Assad regime. What we don't have is evidence regarding the chain of command. And I think it's, but I think it's really important because what I fail to see the logic of someone very senior in the regime ordering this at the time and in the circumstances. But throughout this conflict, there's a lot of different sources of information. I discount many of them, but the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, you can go to their website, it's not very professional, and a lot of mistakes and stuff, but they have systematically documented abuses by all parties to the conflict. I trust them because the people who started that organization took on Assad, they've been complaining about his human rights record for decades, not just since the uprising. And for that reason, I discount many members of the FSA when they talk about it because they benefited under this regime for years and have switched sides. Good for them, but I'm not going to necessarily believe everything they say. But the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, I think 4 or 5 days afterwards, they seemed to have the best ground information. They were pointing in that direction. And we now have fully independent analysis. Human Rights Watch published a piece. They said wasn't conclusive, but the overwhelming evidence suggested it was government soldiers. So we just don't know at what level that was ordered. It might well be that the senior regime members were deeply embarrassed and surprised by their use, but we just don't know. On the regime change point, I agree that now that may not be the key point for the Americans, but it's undeniable that when this conflict started in 2011, we have to remember there's only 2 years ago, what was happening? We were changing the regime in Libya successfully. And the way these policies work, we were told very soon into the Syrian crisis that its only solution for the West would be Assad's departure. And that, I think, to my mind, that deeply compromised our ability to be pushing a peace process. I think, and I talked to people close to those talks at different points, and this was a major problem. Of course, Russian support for Assad was a major problem. It's like, the Russians couldn't see an outcome that removed Assad, and the Americans couldn't see an outcome that kept him there. And both were therefore, in a way, predetermining or blocking the possibility of the kind of discussion you needed where everyone has to sit at the table. I mean, as much as we hated Milosevic, and as much as atrocities he had to account for, he was the guy who signed the Dayton Accord in 1995, and it took another 5 years before he was out of power. In the Kosovo conflict, when Milosevic did this to the West for 78 days to NATO as we bombed and eventually had to bomb in Belgrade, the Kosovo conflict ended keeping Milosevic in power. It was never a condition that he had, much as we would have liked it, but that wasn't a deal that was on the table. So there is a bit of, not optimism, but let's say we can be at least hopeful that the kind of circumstances that you've been discussing with this coming together, preparing the ground for negotiation, where Assad sadly will be at the table, of course he'll be at the table, but so will all these other characters. There's a possibility of that in the way that there wasn't in 2011, 2012.
David, I'll just be picky for a moment, if I may. We did not have successful regime change in Libya. We had successful regime removal in Libya.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes before the conclusion, so I would like to take the next set of 3 questions, please.
Hello, my name is Paul Tanasi. I'm a graduate of International Relations from University of Ottawa. I have a question about the foreseeable future. I clearly don't see any crystal balls on the table, so I ask the distinguished panelists not to chastise me too much for asking the following question. Whom do you see, and by whom I mean nations, coalition, international organization, leading from behind or from the front to solve this conundrum now, in 3 months from now, in 9 months from now? Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Michelle Waintrop. I'm also with the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, second year. Oh, Michelle Waintrop, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, second year. I just have a really quick question, actually. So if we were to discuss the referent object in the case of Syria, understanding its subjectivity, I'd like to just get your opinions on what should be secured, whether it should be the individual, the state, or the international system and its stability.
Thank you. Please.
Hello. My name's Chris Marriott. You can count me amongst those who think, who are happy that the commander-in-chief of the largest military force on earth has not chosen to unilaterally go in and use force. I think the idea that he is consulting his Congress and his Senate and waiting for the UN to make its decision on whether or not chemical weapons were used and who used them, and waiting for an international consensus before going in is something that we should all be happy about, given that they are the biggest military force on earth and have used it unilaterally in the past. I would like to ask the panel, given his interest in seeming interest in trying to gain consensus for the before the U.S. uses its military might, how the panel would see him dealing with this differently. Thank you.
Thank you. So, back to the panel.
Okay, maybe I'll just take the question on who can lead from behind or in the front. What was it? In relation to, presumably in relation to this diplomatic effort. Well, there's all the obvious P5 who are already prominent in the discussion, but it's some of the regional actors. The Prime Minister of Turkey is a mercurial character, but they're a major player, an absolutely key player. They've been involved, they've been close, but we could be doing things to make them more involved and make them closer and give them a more prominent role. It's striking to me that the Gulf monarchies who are arming the rebels, and again, from very early days, the story is there was this peaceful uprising, and for months and months and months, the protesters were shot. It's true, the protesters were shot, but actually the first attacks, armed attacks on soldiers and police in Syria happened 6 weeks into the uprising. Given that Syria is an authoritarian country and arms are not readily available, that there was already, from very early days, an effort to arm the protesters, and that happened very quickly. So the Gulf monarchies, I don't see them playing a constructive role necessarily, but they need to be involved. Any process that didn't bring them in, bring them close, and make them see the wisdom of changing some of their policy would be bound to fail. Now, the key question, of course, is Iran. What can Iran do to end this conflict? John Mundy was here earlier. I don't know if he's still around. I don't care to speculate. I'm not by any means an expert on Iran's role in the region, but it does seem to me that if we're going to have a deal, that key Shia armed factions, including Hezbollah, but others, are going to abide by, that Iran is going to be pretty crucial to that deal. We shouldn't completely discount the fact that Iran might be a constructive part of this process. So I think Iran should be involved. But your question was maybe about who's going to broker the deal. It's striking. Maybe the UN is just too compromised, but it's very interesting. There is a UN special envoy dedicated to this conflict. He's one of the UN's most seasoned negotiators, Lakhdar Brahimi. I Googled this the other day. He's almost invisible. He's in the press today because they met him in Geneva. But he's been there for a year, and before him, Kofi Annan. The UN has been really sidelined. I don't know if that can be rescued and if the UN should be playing a key role or not. But the if there's going to be an honest broker, it's not going to be Russia, and it's not going to be the U.S., and it's not going to be Britain, and probably not France either. I don't think it's Canada's role, but maybe, if not, is it the UN? And if it's not the UN, then where's the honest broker? Where's the Marti Ahtisaari who emerged on day 60 of NATO's campaign in Kosovo and flew to Belgrade? I don't know the answer to that question, but somebody's going to have to emerge.
Roland.
I thought that was an excellent answer. I would just say that the UN seems, Brahimi's there. I mean, he's got credibility. He's been laying the groundwork, waiting for the circumstances to change. Frankly, he's had an impossible task up until now. I haven't seen any indication that the parties see him as not, an appropriate avenue or intermediary. What exact form any ultimate talks would take, who knows? The discussion is to create the Geneva II, a conference, and take it from there, supported, who knows, by a contact group of countries, supported by the UN. Certainly, as you say, the regional countries need to be involved. Turkey, I go even a bit further, that Iran needs to be engaged eventually. And so that's the foreseeable future answer. But again, conditions on the ground also have to be amenable to that kind of negotiation. Which of these ref security objects needs to be secured? I mean, my kind of somewhat acute answer would be all of the above. The international system all the way down to the individual. I mean, that's what we want. But I guess your question raises the point that there are often trade-offs, and it actually helps us to think about the distinction between something like R2P, which the principle being to protect civilian populations against mass atrocities, and the defense of the chemical weapons norm or non-use norm, which is overlapping but not identical. And the United States has made it absolutely clear that to the extent that they were and are still contemplating the use of armed forces to uphold the non-use of chemical weapons, it's not. They haven't been using the language of R2P here, and it makes sense because over 100,000 Syrians were killed before the major chemical weapons attack of August 21st. Coming back to the earlier question, I didn't get a chance to get in on the question of why would Assad have used chemical weapons in the first place? I would rephrase the question. Why was there such a big chemical weapons attack on August 21st? We don't know certainly that it was Assad. We don't know certainly that it was regime forces. I think David described this kind of state of the evidence quite well. It's likely, if not very likely, that it was regime elements that were responsible for perpetrating that attack. But there's also some evidence, and British and French intelligence services seemed pretty convinced that there had been prior much smaller uses of chemical weapons on the battlefield, apparently also by regime forces. So then, if that's true, and this is a big if, so I'm moving into the realm of the hypothetical here, and I want to emphasize that, the question might be, why would we see a movement from very small, kind of almost experimental use of chemical weapons, which the United States could in effect ignore, and Obama could say, well, it's not... Well, I was talking about a major movement of weapons, or major use, which is how the U.S. administration was starting to spin this. Why did they move? Why would the Assad regime have moved into the very dangerous territory for them of using chemical weapons on a large scale? And I have two theories, and they are totally guesses. One is that they perceived that they were actually in greater danger in the suburbs of Damascus than we realized, and that they felt that there was a level of urgency that justified the risk of that larger use. The second possibility is that it was accidental. The scale of it was not ordered from on high. If there have been previous cases, if there were in fact previous cases of chemical weapons used by the regime on an ongoing basis, several cases, hard for me to imagine that the highest levels of the regime wouldn't have had knowledge of that. The question then is, well, why do you get such a big attack? And who knows, maybe one day we'll know the answer to that question.
Bob?
Well, I think the first two questions have been dealt with very effectively by my colleagues on the panel, and I certainly have no disagreement with what they have said and speculated. I guess the last question was sort of, shouldn't we be glad about Obama's due diligence? Personally, you will have gathered from my opening remarks, I'm very glad of his due diligence because where he was headed was going to create enormous problems. But I'm not very glad about the way he proceeded to exercise his due diligence. It was not, it didn't look like firm, clear, forceful leadership. He, as you know from what I've already said, I think he mortgaged his threat enormously so that, I mean, if you were Assad, I'm going to strike you, but I'm not going to do anything serious. Frankly, it sounded to me very much like Obama's announcement of the surge in Afghanistan, where he said to West Point in December '09, for all these reasons, and therefore I'm going to surge 3,000 troops next year, and then we'll begin to go home the following year. If I were the Taliban, I would have been laughing myself sick in the face of such a threat. And similarly, I don't think Assad was much moved by the threat of we're going to do something to hit you, but we won't really engage.
Just let me make a comment further to what Bob is talking about. I think the problem is that Obama did it in a very tentative, didn't quite know that he knows what he's doing. The consensus question, there are lots of ways to have consensus. It's conveniently forgotten, including by many who approved the Iraq War, that the U.S. did actually have a very big consensus within the U.S. to attack Iraq. Now, when it started to go badly, all those people that approved it originally, tentatively, tacitly, kind of forgot that, or a lot of them did. But there was not overwhelming opposition to the Iraq War at the beginning. It came after that.
It was a consensus based on a lie.
Whatever it was based on, it was there. So there are different ways, and that's why I find the way Obama went about it was not very leader-like. It also was not at all clear he was going to wait for a vote in both houses. He hedged a lot. If we were here a week ago, we'd be saying, well, maybe he's kind of was working on the Senate vote. And there was a lot of speculation that the Senate approved it, he'd kind of delay the House vote and he'd go ahead. And presumably his reason would be the Senate is in charge of foreign policy and so on. So to me, it was just weakness in how he did it. And I think he has been hurt. I think he has been hurt domestically, and I think he's been hurt internationally. And that is not in our interests. I mean, we in Canada like to sit and take pot shots at the Americans, but the fact is, they do overall more good in the world than bad, which isn't to say they haven't done some bad things. And there are many ways in which we the world, benefit from having the Americans. And so it's not in our interest to have a weak American president. But I think he has weakened himself.
Yeah, we're winding down here, so maybe just to stir things up, I'll disagree with Margaret on the last point. My view in relation to the Middle East, more broadly, I agree with you. American power works in ways in the world that does achieve results that I would want to see in many places. But frankly, the Middle East, it's quite, right now we're starting the countdown to 2014, and we'll be deluged with press accounts of the First World War, and lead up to war, and that'll all be filtered through a Canadian lens. And I'm almost certain none of that will talk about the fact that basically the problem we're looking at in the Middle East today grew out of that war. The Ottomans were losing power in the Middle East. The French and the British encouraged that, but didn't encourage independent states. They wanted to replace Ottoman power with their power. And you can trace an awful lot of what's wrong in the Middle East today to the meddling of Western powers. Now, that doesn't by any means give Assad any excuse for the atrocities or explain dictatorship today or justify it. But the fact of the matter is that outside interference in that region has generally not achieved good results. And actually, to my mind, if an American president faces the Middle East and comes out bruised, that might not be a bad result. because maybe it'll make people think again about, why is it the U.S.'s problem? Why is it the U.S.'s problem? The British had to learn this in 1956 in Suez. It took a long time for them to realize it, but they backed off. Now they're encouraged again. But why is this our problem? There's questions about Iran and its nuclear weapons. That concerns me. But it might be of a different order than the kind of basically one-sided meddling that has too often characterized U.S. policy in the region. We hear a lot about the Russian naval base in Syria, for example. But how often do you hear about the U.S. naval base in Bahrain, and that perhaps explaining why the U.S. has defended the Bahrain regime, which has also killed protesters, by no means on the same scale as Syria. But it is a regime that lacks legitimacy and has engaged in human rights abuse and is responsible for repression historically. And, the U.S. position vis-a-vis the Bahraini government is very different than its position vis-a-vis other governments because it has a base in Bahrain. It's not just the Russians and their bases. So I'm not so worried about a bruised American president in the Middle East. That would be
Not in the Middle East, but it's bruised just for one area of the world.
fair enough.
Yes.
Okay, my name is Peggy Hobart. I just wonder if why there isn't a bit more skepticism about perhaps I agree with that gentleman who considered that the possibility of the rebels using the gas. And I'll give you some facts, well, some apparent facts, and I don't know. Apparently, there was a seizure at the Turkish border from a rebel of a canister of chemical weapons. I think it was sarin gas on the Turkish border, and it was in the hands of a rebel. And apparently the March incident, according to the Russians, was done by the rebel forces. And the suburb of Damascus, where the people died, was also probably the people who died, they were loyal to the regime. But it had been a territory that had been recently taken over by the rebels. So if the rebels wanted to do an internal incident. And the other thing is, if they had, which also has been reported but not verified, that they had taken over at least one of the 50 sites which had the gas. So, and there's some other things that are outliers a little bit that you haven't mentioned. One is the Israeli influence. And one is, like Eisenhower, when he left office, said, beware the military-industrial complex in his own country. He was telling people to be wary of that. So you would wonder who benefits in the United States by having attacks continue, or military attacks. There's just a lot of things that seem to point to the possibility that it could be rebels. And who had the biggest advantage? Like, who wanted that red line to be crossed? Who would win? And the other thing that hasn't been mentioned is apparently the regime itself was winning. Assad's regime was winning the ground war in Syria at the time that all this happened. So it's just, and another thing that hasn't been mentioned is the Iranian new leader has made a peace offering to a very pacifist statement to Obama, and that some of these things seem to be ignored, and like the influence of the Jewish PAC in the United States in all of this. But none of that seems to be mentioned. I know it's very complex.
I think we all answered this. I think you're wrong. If you say you don't know it, but there are facts, there's already a problem there. I respect you may have a different view, but I think overwhelming evidence points to the use of these weapons by forces loyal to the regime.
Well, I just find it curious that if you read American media, they're far more just accepting of sort of the security analysis. But if you've learned from the analysis during the Iraq War, Reuters, if you read them, they're far more skeptical about, because it seems to have been the security advice is opinion. Like, why haven't they identified, like a Brett Wesley works?
Sorry, but I think you put your question. I think it's been answered. I think you should give someone else a chance.
Okay.
Thank you.
But I have read Wesley works, but I did.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay. Now, given that we only have a few minutes left, I will ask the panelists to choose one message or a statement that they would like to conclude their participation today with. Absolutely, in reverse order. And therefore, 2 points. No, one. You have to choose one, not two. No provisions.
Okay. Oh boy, I really wanted to talk about why Assad might be willing to get rid of his chemical weapons, but I'm not going to talk about that because I'm not allowed. So you'll have to tell me, you'll have to approach me afterwards. I'm going to talk about something else, which is just a thought to leave you with. One of my concerns coming out of all of this recent upheaval, and that is 2.5 years after the events, the beginning of what was then called the Arab Spring, is the temptation that that governments outside the region may feel, including Western governments, and I think back nostalgically to the day where secular autocrats could kind of keep a lid on all of these forces. And we saw little hints of that in the response to the coup in Egypt, which was the coup that couldn't be called a coup. And the sense that stability is something that is needed now. Stability, and to the extent that the military and reliable secular autocrats might provide that kind of stability, isn't that better than the kind of chaos? And it's a very appealing in some ways temptation. The danger is, as I think ahead, I think about this region as opposed to the Syria case, and I think about this moment in history and trying to step back and think about more the broader sweep, is that we end up back in a situation where we are in effect reproducing the kinds of conditions and external strategies that fostered, that contributed to a rise of extremism in the first place, suppression of political development. And so I very much hope that as we move forward and struggle, grope our way through this very challenging set of policy challenges, where we are still in the very early stages, these convulsions that are just having aftershocks and reverberating through the region, that we not lose sight of some of the mistakes that we've made in the past, not just mistakes in terms of ill-considered intervention, but mistakes in terms of expedient decisions about what might seem to be, on the surface, least bad option for stability, but which could lead to greater problems down the road.
Thank you all. Margaret.
I guess I would just finish with a comment of caution about outrage going directly to action. I think, of course, we are all outraged by the pictures of suffering by all sides on the Syrian war. There is no veto or no ownership of outrage only on one side. There's lots of outrage been created, and lots of people died, lots of people who have been fled their homes, lots of people have been injured. That doesn't mean that we can do something. Of course we can do something in the sense of humanitarian aid, but we cannot necessarily end it. In fact, I would argue, in fact, that an end has to come from people there. Now, can we help it? I'm using the royal we of the West, perhaps, but we certainly, and David is right to remind us of the post-World War I world that was created by those who thought they knew better and could draw lines on a map. And while we don't draw lines on a map so much anymore, we do tend to say, well, if this is good for us and we like this kind of government, that must be the kind of government that's good for them. And in the end, we forget that the government and the culture that we created has been created over many centuries of what suited us. And Syria will not be the last crisis. There will be more. And there is always pressure that we must do something to end this. And of course we're outraged. And if we could wave a wand and have it end, that would be great. But very, very seldom, if ever, can we do that. So I would, advise a note of caution of the path from outrage to action. Doesn't mean you do nothing, but be very careful what you do that it doesn't make it worse. We have lots of historic examples where that was the case.
Thank you, Margaret. David?
Yeah, any time in a situation as horrible as this, when so many people are dying, when you put forward the idea that maybe a military response isn't the best one, I think it's incumbent on you then to suggest to people what they can do. And there are things we can do. I mentioned the refugee issue. There's the justice issue. The International Criminal Court isn't involved. We can still put pressure on the Security Council. That's a long, hard slog, but there's something short of that. Many states, Canada included, already have in their criminal legislation universal jurisdiction provisions that allow us to try war criminals in our country. The crime doesn't have to be committed here. And there's nothing stopping Canada and a group of other countries, and there'd be many countries prepared and interested to do this, not just Western countries, from drawing up a list. The UN Commission of Inquiry has prepared very good details of a whole bunch of incidents. They've named units involved. It's not such a big deal. Come forward. Imagine if 40 governments came forward and said, here's a list of 200 people. By the way, 40 of them are from the rebel side, who are also committing abuses. No matter what, we're committed to arresting and prosecuting these people for forever. So and advertise it. I mean, there's ways you can bring pressure even if the Security Council is blocked. We could broaden the sanctions regime outside of the UN. We could work with the Arab League to tighten the sanctions regime they've already agreed to. There's by some estimates 10 to 15,000 political prisoners in Syria. They must be in appalling conditions. They don't have full access to the ICRC. We can make demands that the regime might give concessions on, which would immediately alleviate people's suffering or their treatment. In other words, there's lots of things we can do. None of them are a good answer to the bigger problem. But we mustn't, our deep skepticism about the military action mustn't sort of paralyze us into thinking there's nothing else we can do in the short term. So that's the thought I'd leave you with. Thank you.
David. Oh.
Well, I agree with what all my fellow panelists have said up till now. David, the collective international legal actions that you've outlined, absolutely, and they do make a difference. Of course, they would make a bigger difference if the United States recognized the International Criminal Court. And that the fact that they do not means that kind of an option never occurs to Americans and simply isn't available to them, and that's too bad. Costanza, you picked me up, I think, earlier about saying that the good Gulf War was different because it was between states and not interstate. The point I was trying to make in my opening remarks has nothing to do with the geostrategic circumstances in any of those cases. It was rather about due diligence before you get tucked in, the point that Margaret ended with, and I agree completely. In other words, we thought out the expulsion of the Iraqis from Kuwait. We didn't think out at all the neocon adventure in Iraq. We did not think out the implications of mission creep in Afghanistan. We sure as hell didn't think out the consequences of the most vulnerable area of the world being covered in weapons as a result of liberating Gaddafi's arsenals. And it is absolutely clear that Washington had not thought out the implications of striking Damascus. And so, yeah, think before you shoot is a pretty good lesson to be drawn from all of this. I'm a little surprised, and I kept trying to be provocative. Margaret even talked about waving a wand, and I'd talk about fairy tale ideas, and I thought those came together quite nicely, but nobody picked up the big R2P debate. Yes, there are things in this world that we in the West and even the indispensable power cannot fix. And tucking ourselves into a civil war in the Middle East where we do not have adequate knowledge and understanding is simply idiotic. And however appalling the suffering, however heartrending were those pictures of gassed children from the Damascus suburb,
we must come to terms with the fact there are things we cannot fix, and therefore, no, not action for the sake of action.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists, and I'd like to ask the audience to join me in thanking the panelists.